So so thanks again for attending the ETL training for day 2, and I'm sure you're having fun with writing up the ETL spec with Rabbit in the Hat. So we will actually start a day with reviewing what you have, any questions you may have for the Rabbit in the Hat, and also we'll kind of do a quick review of the full spec of how to convert from mimic data to CDM. All right. Let me start sharing my screen. Cool. So can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Awesome. So so this is actually what we have done for kind of what's a roadmap as we talk about the ETL spec in general. There is really no like true correct way to do it, and most of the time it's really based on what the source data look like and what's the roadmap you think, and what you have talked with the data owner that you think it's the correct way to use which data for what, and that's the roadmap from the source to CDM. So I would like to start the review process with if you have any questions while you're going through all the different tables from the source to CDM. I'll start with your questions. Any questions or comments? Because there are really a lot, and I do want to spend the 40 minutes on like the ones that people think, it's a bit, I'm not really sure, or is this the correct way to do it? Welcome all the questions or comments you have. I will, or it's just, okay. It's early in the morning, so I'll just start by going through some of the typical ones that I thought that would be interesting to share. So one thing I think it's all can someone mute? Okay. Cool. So I think yesterday we went through kind of the dimension table, with the main dimension table, or the ones that people kind of use. So we did the patient to person mapping. And then also we kind of discussed that too, the patient table, because it also has the death information. So patient also can be linked to the death table in CDM. So you have the subject ID to person ID, and then you have the date of death to the death time, and also as well as the death date and time. So that's for the death table. And because of, as you can see in the death table, there's the cost, what cost the cost of death and the source value and all that, because as you can see in the mimic data, there was no place, or there's just no source data for the cause of death information. So therefore, for the death table, we're only kind of filling in the three fields that we just looked at, and we had to kind of keep the other fields like empty, because it's just the source data don't have that information, so we can't really do anything about it. So it's okay to leave it blank. And also, as you can see, there is no information linked to the device table. And also that's the same thing. We don't have the device here, and node NLP, and then because of the error table, as we mentioned yesterday, so those are really the derived one. We are not, really doing anything during the ETL spec writing part. So all of those are, nothing is linked to those tables. So I want to kind of quickly explain those ones, and also the same thing. So we did not use all of the source tables here because of different reasons, that we're only taking the information CDM needs and then basically put it into the CDM. So we're not really using all of the table from each side because of, really just depends on your data. I see there is no, there's a one question. We map the DOD hospital to, So the SSN, okay, let's see. So that's really for the person table, the patient table from the source data. So not this one. So for the DoD SSN, from my so this is or the hospital. I think from I can't remember exactly, but from the data dictionary when they were, so because we already, basically there are 3 different date of death, and we decided to, I think it was according to the Mimic Data Dictionary that we shared in the link, that we decided to use this one. And those 2, because they're pretty much, I guess it's just another source of the death date that we decided not to use. So those 2 basically is having the same information as the DoD, and there's really no need to put it in, any other tables like observation. And observation is really for, so that's another question. Observation is what in OMOP's definition, it's a little bit similar to a condition, but it's not condition. It's something you observed, like smoker, not smoker. So that's observation. And also kind of for the questionnaires that people filled in, if they have like a history, family history. So it's not their own things, it's their family has a history of diabetes, all those information are what we're considering into the observation table. Yep. So as Jiawei mentioned too, so those 2 variables, they're just another source that we use to basically the DoD kind of already capture both of the information. So really we do not need to use those 2 variables again for the other tables. Good question. Cool. So hope that answers your question. And then, so one quick thing is really kind of, we talk about the diagnosis ICD. And again, I think this is probably the ones, as we mentioned, it's better to kind of try it yourself because this is very typical. Actually, a simplified version, because I think in reality, sometimes we feel the diagnosis thing is actually very complicated, but I think this one is still, it has the ICD-9 code, which is already pretty good. So we have the condition concept ID that we discussed yesterday. So this ICD code actually goes through 3 different fields. We use that to map the OMOP standard ID. We keep it as the source value, and also we look it up the ICD-9's concept ID, and then we put it in the condition source concept ID. So basically, we're using one field from the source, and then we're using the information to 3 different fields in the CDM table.
So, hey, sorry, I'm going to interrupt here on the DoD. So the DoD, because there are 3 dates in there, right? There's one that says the date of death. There's one that says the date of death recorded in the hospital record, and the third is the date of death recorded in Social Security records, right? Under the one patient. Technically, this would be one of those scenarios that it depends on what the actual business rules are and who defined those business rules. And all we have is a data dictionary that says, right, it's the date of death, it's the date of death recorded in the hospital, it's the date of death recorded in the Social Security records. Now, the Mimic is still a US-based data. So what this really represents is the 3 different things. One is Mimic's data death record. Second thing is if they have a hospital recording. The third thing is if it was sent to the Social Security office here in the US. So technically, if we actually understood the way the US system works as well as this data, you may have a rule in there that says which one takes precedence, right? Because sometimes maybe the date of death is not filled in. Maybe it is the date at the hospital, or maybe it's the date at Social Security. However, there can also be a conflict as well. Knowing the way our system works, that the Social Security might record a different date than your actual date of death, than a different date in the hospital. So then you have to, talk to your data owners and think about, and they would have to come up with you to say which one is the rule of preference, which one is the source of truth, right? Is it the one that you have that's just DoD, or is it the one that says it's in the hospital, or is it the one that's on the Social Security? Me, I probably go with the one with the Social Security office, because that's everybody has to send something to the Social Security office when someone dies in the United States. That's how. That's really where our master record sits. So again, in this case, Jing and those guys only mapped the DoD because they thought the other two was already a merge of the other one, right? Maybe that's what it says in the mimic documentation, but I'm just looking at the field names in the data dictionary section and knowing that, and taking an assumption that this is US data and knowing how the administration of Social Security operates. So those are things, that's an example of why you need a data expert, right? And that's an example of where you can have an or statement where all three of them would be mapped to those death date and death times. And there's rules in there that says which one is which and which one takes precedence over the other. Hopefully that helped.
Cool. Thank you, Mui. So that's on the question. And I see there's another question which Salva has already answered, which is actually our next topic too, that we will be talking about the actual ETL development. So it's really kind of the flow of the two-day training. We start with what is ETL and how do we do vocabulary mapping, and now that we have the mapping, how do we design the roadmap, and then the next step will be kind of how do we actually do the development, which will be the next session. All right. So for any other questions, did I miss anything? Yes. For the ETL spec writing. So one thing I want to talk.
Question, ma'am.
Hello.
So
oh yes, please.
Yeah. Let's say we are done with mapping before we generate that Word document. If you want to just make sure, did we address all the required fields? Is there any report that will show us quickly, or do we need to just go through one table at a time?
There's no report. You have to go through it one at a time, okay. Unfortunately. So, but the cool thing about it does tell you when you go into every table, right, which ones are required. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, if you don't have data for the whole table, then you don't need to populate it all. But if you populate one record, then yeah, you have to fill in all the required fields. Like here, the measure type concept ID is required. So you have to write a rule for what that is. It may not come from the source table, but like she said here, she set it to this because she knows that these are all EHR records, so therefore that's why she's using it like that. So it doesn't have to come from your source field.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yep. So kind of for the other clinical tables, I want to go through the measure one because we kind of already talked about condition, and condition is very similar to procedure. So I won't talk about procedure again, but then for measurement, it's a bit different with a bit more kind of fields to fill, especially because I think the confusing part is because we have so many different measurements, and then they have different values. Sometimes they are a text, positive, negative. Sometimes it's a number, it's 1 to 3, and then they have a unit, whether it's like milligram, it's gram, it's different measurement. Like even for like height, sometimes we see there's meters, there is like centimeters, all that. So I want to talk about measurement really quick, kind of just a bit of common the issues we need to kind of pay attention to while doing the ETL spec. So subject ID is to person ID. I won't talk too much about it. And then we have the item ID. So that one would really be kind of what exactly is the mapping, or what exactly is the text. It's a red blood cell count, or it's the TSH count, T3, T4, all that will be also similar things as the condition. You will need to do vocabulary mapping to map those, whether it's a code or whether it's just a text string. You need to map it to the measurement standard concept ID. And again, because this is the ID, so we keep it in the source file as well, the measurement source value as well. And also the source ID, if applicable, if they have a concept ID in OMAP. And then this is the time, and then for the value, so that's the tricky part, because the value in CDM, we save the value different, like kind of really in detail. So there could be, so first of all, we have value as number. So that, just think about, HbA1c or all that. Most of the measurement tests, the lab tests, you will have a number. So that's where we save the number. And then there is another part, which is value as concept ID. So like I mentioned, like for example, like the COVID test, you have positive or negative. So for positive, this word, we do have so if you look it up in Athena, you will see the concept for positive and concept ID for negative. And then here, instead of saving it as positive or negative, we will save it as the condition, the concept ID for those values. So that would be, for those lab results. And then, of course, this will also goes into the unit source value and the unit, the value the value source value, because it has, like the positive or negative. So all that will also be saved here if you want to go to the source version. So that's kind of, from the one value variable, we kind of also kind of split it up into three different fields into the CDM table. Any questions on that? And also we see kind of there's the different, as you can see here, that's the different units, and all of those can be found in Athena as well. So instead of the actual unit, we will look it up, like for example, for the PG, we'll look it up, what's the concept for that, and then put in the concept ID in the unit concept ID field instead of the actual value, and the actual value goes into the unit source value fields. So that's about the measurement table. Cool. So that's for the measurement table. And is there any other tables you would like me to kind of walk you through? Or we can do one more for the prescriptions. So that's for the drug table. So drug is yes, I'm reading your mind, Stephen. Yes, well, I'll do the prescription table next. So drug table is another kind of tricky ones, or the ones that will spend more. So I think condition and procedure are very similar and kind of simpler. And then for drug and measurement, they have obviously more fields than the other two because of the complexity of it. So that's okay. Let's go through the prescription or drug exposure table. So subject ID to person ID, and then we have the admission ID. So that will actually goes into the visit occurrence. So basically, you see what visit this drug prescription is coming from. And then we have the start date, the end date, and again, so the drug start date are the mandatory fields. So you have to have this one. This is start here. And so if you go down, so here, because like we mentioned, the mimic data, so this is actually a US based data, so it's using the NDC code, that is the National Drug Code for the US, so which is also a vocabulary that has been mapped already in OMAP. So here you can use the NDC code to look it up. For the drug concept ID. So if you have so it's very similar to the ICD-9 or ICD-10 that we discussed yesterday. So once you already have a code from existing vocabulary, so you can then use that to find what's the mapping for it, using the vocabulary mapping methods that Professor Yu talked about yesterday, and then similar things, you do that for the NDC drugs, drug codes, and then you find the drug concept ID. And again, so those will go to the source value and the concept ID as well. And then you see for the dose information and the unit information, it all goes into the drug dose and the drug unit variable here in the drug exposure table. So one other thing is the route information, which here we have a route. So basically route is really means whether it's oral, it's injection, you know, all that. Oh, there's basal, there's bolus. You know, whether it's like, you know, or just a IV or something like that will be the route. And then we'll look it up what the IV bolus, and then they'll find that the concept through Athena, and then put them in the route concept ID. And then the last thing, the last one is you still need to put the source route information into the route source value. So now that you probably have seen, it's really just a theme here. You use the source information to find the corresponding concept, and also you put the source route or source concept or source vocabulary into the source value field as well. So basically, you use the information twice for the CDM fields. So
that's on the notes, please.
That is a very good question. So the question is how to separate discharge, prescription, and in-hospital medicine. So that's definitely a very good question. And also there's, you know, if they just go to a pharmacy to get the medication and all that. So that will be in the drug type concept ID. So this currently is setting at a EHR, which is a high level one. But if you could, because here we do not know if they are, you know, in hospital or discharge or even outpatient prescription that just go to the pharmacy, pick up themselves. So it did not really distinguish that, but you can distinguish all those difference and find the corresponding concept ID and then put in the drug type concept ID. So the type concept ID are really describing the origin of the information. For example, like the condition type concept ID, we have, you know, it's a claim or it's an outpatient diagnosis from the EHR system. That's for the condition type ID, and then for drug is really to distinguish, as you mentioned here, whether it's discharge, it's inpatient, it's in hospital, or it's just an outpatient prescription. So all of that will be stored here if you have those information in the big data, which we don't. So we did not really go down that details.
I had one question on the note or the note NLP table. In general,
note?
Yeah, is in general, like within the scope of this OMAP, right? Is there a time when, let's say we save a radiology notes or something? Is there a scope for, you know, saving like an image file name or something?
Yeah, very good question. So currently, Molly, correct me if I'm wrong. So I do not think there is no, to answer your question, no. We are not saving the image within the OMAP CDM scope, but of course you can save it additionally, like at the side. So you still have the OMAP CDM plus the image, because image is really it's also kind of privacy-wise, it's sensitive information because that's on a person. And so No, the imaging information, the imaging procedure will be saved in the procedure occurrence table, but the actual image itself, like a CT scan or something, so that is not saved within the CDM scope.
Yeah, there's actually a forum post about how to save imaging information, and there's been discussions about it. And I know like the psychiatry working group is making some changes, because in psychiatry they do a lot of imaging and CT scans and you know, ultrasounds and all that fun stuff. So they have been talking about, I don't know where they are with that discussion, but I do know they are talking about potentially adding like a third dimension to measurements, because from some of their brain scans that they do, it's a 3-dimensional result, versus in our measurement table, it only stores 2 dimensions. So again, you would have to go to some of the working groups to see where they are, because what happens is then the working groups discuss them, and then they bring it back to the OMAP CDM group. And if they are able to design the new structure, they give it to that group, and then they'll release it as part of one of the CDM versions. And then the question about how do you separate, you know, prescriptions in hospitals to like pharmacies, there is the type. So I'm going to steal your screen for a second. Over here, if you go to Athena, when you click on type concept, that's where that type concept field for every single table helps you distinguish. Now, again, like I said, the folks are picking this one because it's a mimic data. But again, depending on what it is, you can use claims here, right? So it came from a claims database, so you know these are dispensed. Or you can say it's an EHR, but you basically pick one of these and see which one fits best to your folks, right? Some of these actually will tell you like EHR prescription, versus some of them will say it's dispensed record, or some of them will actually say it was taken or given by the doctor. You just have to go. I can't remember which one is which, but you just have to go through them. Some of them will actually say pharmacy, dispensed by pharmacy, or something like that. Can't remember. Outpatient, one of these are pharmacy ones. But it will say all that for you so that you can better determine where it is. The other thing would be the route, right? You can look at the route to help you distinguish the route that was done. So was it administered orally, blah, blah, blah. So that stuff is what helps you distinguish between the different types that you get from a hospital to a claims to potentially just the clinical doctor's office, right? I don't know about you guys, but where we are, our clinical practices are separate from a hospital. A hospital is really meant for either outpatient surgeries or meant for inpatients, right? We don't do clinical like outpatient visits there. Those you actually go to a doctor's office. And then we have the emergency room. So for us, we have 3 different things that you can do in 3 different areas, and they're 3 different systems. So thus we capture them differently. But that's what you would use, is this type to help find you the right one. There is now in the wiki site, it tells you which one to use. So if you go to the CDM wiki site, that was something that we thought was extremely confusing to the whole world, that you don't know exactly which one to use because if you're new, right? So under the drug type concept ID, it will actually, I believe, provide guidance to you as to which ones to use. Actually, I think has a link to the search terms of the ones that you can pick from. So I suggest you guys look at that. And then I think there's a question about the costing.
Yes. Okay. So about the cost information, so that will be in, as you can see. Oh, let me share again. Let me share again. So as you can see here, there is no, let's just click on cost. So you'll see kind of what the cost table look like. So the cost is actually I think if you remember from yesterday, we talked about kind of what's the workflow, what's the normal order when we do, all of, obviously there are many different CDM tables, and then we normally do cost at last, which means it's a bit different. So first of all, if you can look at the table on your right, the first thing you would, so it's the structure of cost table is very different. So I think I can spend another like 20 minutes talking about what the cost table look like and how you, but basically, so as you can see here in cost table, it has the cost ID, which is just a unique auto-generated number. So it has the cost event ID. So this event ID is linked to the drug exposure ID. It's linked to the drug exposure ID in your case, in your question, that it's looking, it will use the cost event to link to the occurrence of your drug description, drug prescription. And then with that, we all has, then the cost domain will be drug, and then the cost type concept ID. So that will be what where you save, the insurance information, and then that's kind of where you save, and then also you have the currency, and the total charge, total paid, because there is the insurance difference. The hospital can charge how many, but then ended up getting paid maybe not the same amount, and happens pretty often. So that's kind of where you save, and what is paid by the payer, by the patient, all of the fun medical insurance stuff, that's all saved here in the cost table, but by using the drug exposure ID as the linkage. So it's actually not using person as the unique key, but it's actually using the event ID, either drug exposure ID or condition occurrence ID and all of that. So that would be the cost table. Very good question. Cost table is a bit confusing. I want to be honest, it's just a lot of information you need to fill here, and also because it kind of covers all of the clinical events. You will, in different clinical events are all included in here. So it will be a gigantic table to start with, and also with a lot of fields to take into consideration of all the different medical insurance bits and parts, who paid for what kind of thing, and everything is included and designed in a cost table.
There's another question on here about if your data or if you are unable to map it, like if you're unable to map your medical coding to something in the vocabulary, then where does the domain fall, right? So if you're unable to map one of your field or one of your codes to an OMOP CDM standard, and you set it to 0, then it stays in the one that you're going with, right? So if it's a diagnosis, then it would stay in the condition table. If it's a measurement, it would stay, or a lab test, it would stay in the measurement table. Unless you know that you can map it to something else, because you're mapping it to 0, it just stays with the table that it would normally go to. So it wouldn't go to another domain. It would just stay in the same domain table as your original source.
Cool.
Okay, there's another question in here. Sorry, but I wonder whether you could share your mapping file in Rapid and HAP for the class to use. Jing, that's a question for you. How can you share this whole file for them?
Good question. Because the whole file is actually it's a JSON zip file, and also, so I think it's not. I will figure out if it's.
I think you can export it, and then you would have to put it onto Google.
Yeah. On or if I can email to people. It's.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't think it's that big of a file, which I can do that. And also, I want to just. So one last thing, after you have everything here, or after you finish, you can actually generate the ETL document, which is just a Word file that I want to share, want to quickly go through with everyone too. So kind of like after you did all of the linking, the writing of the comments, and now that you basically finished all of finished the preliminary rounds of the ETL design, and then you can actually generate a Word document. And here is the Word document. So it will look like this. It's a 47 pages because so I will share this with people as well, but it's generally the product. So there are two products. One is in Rabbit in the Hat, and then this one is just the generated version of it. As you can see, the source file is actually less because it only took the ones that we used for CDM. Because remember, there were like caregivers, CSV, or some other source tables that we did not really use at all. So it only kept the ones that we use and then the ones that we map to, because this data doesn't have device information, so there's really no device table. So basically, it just condensed what we use or what we designed for the tables. And then it goes to, for example, so it goes by CDM table, and I'll start with the condition one. So you see, okay, what is the linkage? What is the destination field? The source, the logic, the comments, which is what we discussed yesterday. And then it follows the kind of the normal table that we do. And as we mentioned, kind of after you do a couple of times, you really do not kind of use Rabbit in the Hat anymore. It's because kind of you already got the flow of it, and you have the template here. You can manually type it as well. So you can use both Rabbit in the Hat and the just writing up a document, using the hybrid way, which works well, as well. So I won't go through them one by one, but it's very similar it still have the device table, but it's empty because we didn't really have the information. And then it has a drug, which is what we discussed. And then for each of the field, how do we do that? And what is the source? And then those tables is empty because we didn't have any information. So this is really a nice kind of product out of Rabbit in the Hat that you can continue be using and talking with developer, or changing it as you go through more in depth of your source data, and you discover something, you change some of the logic. This will be a very nice way of a working document between the data analyst and also the developer.